This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
Let's move on and look at how some of these same principles show up in politics and geopolitics abroad and at home. Part of our documentary, as I said, started in Egypt. We were looking at the connections of the global wheat crisis. And so to illustrate the point that the global wheat crisis in 2010 affected bread prices in Cairo, which helped drive the revolution, we actually went out to Salina, Kansas, to a wheat farm. We went out to a wheat farm called the Land Institute by Wes Jackson, a great bioscientist, who's trying to develop a perennial form of wheat called kernza that wouldn't have to be tilled. And Wes gave me a tutorial on the difference between polycultures and monocultures. Wes basically explained to me that the prairie was a natural polyculture, provided in many ways its own pesticide, its own fertilizer. It was an incredibly diverse ecosystem. And what we did when we settled the prairie is in many cases we plowed up the polyculture and we planted monoculture crops, wheat, corn, and sorghum. Now, monoculture crops are enormously susceptible to disease. And so they require large amounts of high-density fossil fuels in the form of tractors, fertilizer, and pesticide. When the Dust Bowl happened, by the way, Wes explained to me, the monoculture crops all died, but the prairie, the remaining polyculture prairie, actually survived. So I started thinking about what Wes was telling me, and I simply applied it to the Middle East. I said to him, Wes, that's really interesting, because when you think about it, Al-Qaeda uses high-density fossil fuels in the form of donations from Arab oil states to try to wipe out the polyculture of the Arab Muslim world. The Arab Muslim world at its height was the world's greatest polyculture. In Spain and North Africa, it was an amazing polyculture. And they're trying to wipe out that polyculture and supplant it with a monoculture that is enormously susceptible to diseased ideas. I would argue something parallel to that is going on in this country. Because I think the Republican Party at its height was an amazing polyculture. Teddy Roosevelt gave us national parks. Richard Nixon gave us the Clean Air, Clean Water Act and the EPA. Ronald Reagan gave us radical arms control. George Bush, the father, invented cap and trade. I would argue the Tea Party is using donations, some from oil funds, to wipe out the polyculture of the Republican Party in order to put in place a monoculture that's enormously susceptible to diseased ideas. So this is a lead-in. Again, what's going on in nature can easily get translated into politics.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.